Is my mic on? My mic is on. Good morning, everybody. Very good to see you all here. I think some of the other colleagues might still be in bed after yesterday's lively dinner, but the door stays open so they can all come in. Happy to see you. As I said, this is the second day of the Planetary Security Conference 2019. My name is Marcel Beukeboom. I'm the climate envoy for the Netherlands, and I'll be moderating this first panel of the day. And you see 5 fine panelists here. I'll introduce them later briefly, because you can read their extensive bios in the app and in the program. So we can just get into the the weeds of what we want to do here today, and that is explore the question: what does resilience mean for basically the 3 perspectives: defense, diplomacy, and development? And we have all those 5 perspectives on the panel, so that is hopefully food for some very good interaction and perhaps also some discussion whether it might clash at some points. But to warm you up first, we do something that gives me a little bit of a better idea who we have in the room, and that is the so-called Mentimeter. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. At this point, it's allowed to take your phones out and log in on this website, menti.com, and use the code that's on top. For those who can't read it, 925838. It will stay on top. I'll only do 2 questions, but it gives, I think, a clear impression on who we have here, because that might also help us to later on to get your perspectives into this same debate. So, well, I see the first people get active already. I'll just give you a chance. Actually, you're experienced, if I look at it. Now I should ask for the other. What are you doing, and what are you doing here? But that's. A lot of others. Yeah, in this area, you're never sure whether this is being hacked or not, but it's. The military were quick. I saw that too. And the diplomats. They know how to work this system. This is good. At least we have all 3 perspectives that we have on the panel, and they're not. Only Mr. Jackson is using his phone. I hope you're in there as well. Okay. Very good. So we have the 3 perspectives in the room, which is good, and 78 people, which is also a very nice score for this early Wednesday morning. The next question I have is, do you work for, and that's the same idea, so we have the perspective of your background or your interest, the 3 Ds, or other. And now we have the profession that you have, and we see a larger number of government people in the room. I don't permit myself a remark on that one, what they are all doing here, but it underscores the importance that we have. And basically, if you look at the people in the panel, these are 5 people that dedicated their lives to work for the public cause. And I think that goes for most of us here. This is not something that is rooted in the private sector, although there's some very good private sector involvement in this field. But we are working on a public cause. And when I looked at the title of this session, what are the implications of resilience for these 3 professions, or for these 3 sectors or perspectives, I thought this is pretty difficult to define. So what we might also try to do is define what we're talking about. What does resilience actually mean for all of us? My take was, but we'll get back to that, my take was that for all of us it's an objective. It's an objective that we want to reach, not for ourselves, but for those others that we work for. And we all bring our own unique tools. We all bring our own unique background. But in the end, I think there's an overlapping objective to what we try to accomplish here. And since the hashtag for this conference is doable, I hope at the end of this session to be able to conclude with a few concrete action points, a few concrete ideas to take forward, because this is the 4th Planetary Security Conference already. And the first 2-3 conferences we have spent to really dig deep into the subject. We have also been able to bridge whatever gaps there were between those 3 perspectives. I'm sure we're not there yet, but we're talking to each other and we work together. We learn from each other. So it's time to take those lessons and those learnings into practice and into the next phase. And I think that's also something that Minister Kaag said this morning in the same room. Now it's time to, since we are in this together, it's time to do this together and see where the added value of cooperation is. In my world, the world of climate diplomacy, climate is the main objective. You could say that in the development world we have 17 objectives, and those are the objectives that in 2015 we also all agreed upon. I would argue number 13, climate, is perhaps a bit more important than others, but others would beg to differ, I guess. In diplomacy, and I just recently found that out as well in the annual conference for ambassadors in The Hague. In diplomacy, the broader definition of the term, it ranks not really at the top. There are other issues that sometimes are felt to be more important, and those often start with a P, profit, power, politics, and if we go on, we enter the people, and maybe after some while we also enter into planet, but that is a different perspective and a different value and a different weight that is being given to the issue that we talk about today, because that is the relation for climate with all the other policy objectives. And in defense, it's an open question. I look at my military representatives on the panel as well, and that is what we have been doing here slowly in the past 4 years, and it's getting traction. I just recall 2 years ago when General Middendorp, still in uniform, made headlines, and that was interesting because when asked, he said, "I'm not saying anything new here, but it matters that he said it in a uniform." And he said, "Climate change is a threat to world peace." And that was something that the media picked up, right? And you had to appear in all kinds of television programs, and basically putting this idea of bridging that gap, of working together to a higher level. And that is why we are sitting here today. As I said, we will go over the definitions. We will get into the deep. But when I start with you, General, and think back of those days and those headlines that you made, what has happened since? Have you been able to also continue on that path and let's say introduce the concept broader into the military, or was there a fallback after those headlines and the initial attention that you got, and everybody went back to work, or did it make it up to the strategic ranks in the military? Please, your first reaction, and then we'll go one by one and see whether we can make this an interactive panel. General.
Thank you. I think is it on? Yeah. I think it did put the topic on the agenda. And the first reactions in the media were very fierce. I got all kinds of nicknames. So they started calling me the Green General, which I took as a compliment. But I really stood by my word, and I really meant what I said. So I didn't take one word back of it. Since then, it has become more and more a topic that we are able to discuss without emotions. It is not very much alive in the defense communities, and that's why I'm here. Because I think the defense community should pick up their role as well. And it's not a military topic, climate change, but it does have a security dimension to it that we need to take seriously. And also the military needs to take it seriously. And I can come back on the roles that they can play in there, but I'm glad that we are doing that now. I'm glad that we could announce this International Military Committee on Climate and Security together with Sherry last night, because I think we need to build that network, also on the military side, and that network should connect to all kinds of other civil players to build an ecosystem that can help each other countering climate change.
But if You say climate change is it has strategic value. It's one of the elements that has to be taken into account when you deploy, when you design a strategy. But now you actually use another term as well, is fighting climate change. So there's a role for the military in doing that as well. So bringing in the mitigation element of it.
Yes, I think so. We had a very good roundtable discussion yesterday here upstairs with a lot of military players from different countries. And we had no discussion at all that climate change has this security dimension, that the nexus is there. Everybody sees the security effects of climate change. And there are direct effects caused by extreme weather events, causing all kinds of natural disasters. The sea level rise threatening our coast. We are 3 meters below sea level here, so imagine a 1-2 meters sea level rise, what the impact of that is. Also on key facilities in the coastal areas, also on military facilities in coastal areas. And Anne, she knows all about this. In the US, she works on this every day. So we need to take that very seriously. But there are also indirect threats. And the indirect threats are the climate change feeding the already present roots of conflicts in fragile countries. There is a lot of internal frictions, there are failing governments, there is food shortage, there's water shortage, and climate change just aggravates those problems and feeds the disputes that are already there, leading to more conflicts. So also from that angle, the military should take this seriously, should incorporate this in their intelligence assessments that they make of these fragile countries, and make sure that every define strategies that the climate element is included in that. Because what I've learned in my past is that it's important not to just have situational awareness, as we call it, so watch the surface and watch all the symptoms of a problem, but understand why they are there, understand the root causes, and climate is one of them. And the more you can understand those root causes, the more you're able to push the right buttons to help solve it, together with all the other players, because the military always is only part of a solution.
I was just getting there because at an abstract level I understand what you say, but once we get to the, let's say, more concrete side of it, what do you mean? What do you do, what, for example, a development professional would not do?
Well, I've experienced that when I was a commander in Afghanistan. We had fierce fighting over a village called Chora. We have been fighting for days there. In the end, we won the fight, but we didn't solve the problem. The problem stayed, the tension stayed, and the Taliban could return there. And after a year, we found out what the real problem was. And the real problem was about a dispute over water. It's an agricultural country, there is a shortage of water, and they were fighting over who gets what part of the water. So we brought in civil negotiators, water management experts, that could negotiate a solution. And once that happened, all the problems were gone, and the Taliban was gone. So, and that only shows how defense and development should work together. As an integrated team, also on the ground. And not only in these rooms, but also on the ground.
Okay. Well, thank you for these first enlightening reactions already. I'll just take this as a segue to your former colleague. I think you're both retired now from the military. But Anne Phillips, you served in the Navy for a long time, and also being deployed to several areas in the world. Do you recognize what your colleague says on the practicalities of bringing in other professionals?
Yes, absolutely. Because from the hard security perspective, there are things that we are capable of doing and have great skills, but we need the help of the diplomacy world, and we need the help of the development world as well to put together a full picture, a whole of government approach, a whole of society approach to dealing with the kind of impacts that we are seeing and will continue to see that climate change is imposing upon us.
And so an example like we just heard, where the root cause was, in this case, water. I think that's different when you're at sea. But do you have a comparable example of where you had to bring in the development professionals or the diplomats or other experts to solve a strategic issue?
I think We talked about this a little bit earlier, but my personal example in the field is actually not directly related to water, but it is an experience I had working as a part of the NATO response force in 2005, 2006, supporting an earthquake relief effort in Pakistan. So not an extreme event certainly not a climate change related extreme event, but certainly a naturally caused extreme event where we had United States expeditionary forces present. We had the NATO response force in its first ever deployment present, and of course the Pakistani government and military were present, along with a substantial portion of the NGO communities, UN, you name it, everyone converged on this part of the world to try to solve this problem. And getting the combined diplomatic forces, hard security forces in a different role, really a humanitarian response role, and certainly the development capabilities, and they were all there, development experts, they were all there, aligned and coordinated to deal with this incredible outcome, tragedy, impact on this country, all in an area that was extremely difficult to access. And so in the end, it became an organizational effort. I mean, the way to get everybody organized was get them all in a room together, figure out what the nearest term threats and impacts were, and get those who were best suited to respond to that issue aligned to respond to that issue. We also developed geographic areas of expertise, where the Pakistanis would be in one area, the United States was in another, and NATO was in a third. And then within those, aligned across the development organization and the diplomacy needs to highlight and solve the challenges that were there, whether they were health-related, whether they were food source or food scarcity, shelter-related because the winter was on its way. So a fascinating look at really a whole society effort to assist in this tremendous tragedy, in this sudden shock, if you will, but and also a fascinating opportunity to show how, with that right level of coordination and intense effort on the parts of all of those organizations present, we were able to develop an outcome that was satisfactory for the host nation, and I think ultimately for those who were most severely impacted by the challenge.
Yeah, but you could say that you were working on resilience,
Yes.
but the people that were there, you could argue, were quite resilient because they were still alive.
They were able to survive, but they needed help to continue to be resilient as the weather, through the circumstances of climate, was going to impact them for their future.
Yeah.
So not only them, but their livestock and their way of living. So.
And a similar question as I just posed to General Middendorp is, this all seems to be on the adaptation side of the coin, so to speak. You have to adapt to the changing circumstances. You face more severe situations. Do you see a role from your perspective also on the mitigation side? Do you have to behave differently as a military?
Absolutely. I think there are a number of ways. First of all, back to my whole of government talk, the military cannot do this alone, but they can be a contributing factor. And they have an opportunity to be a significant contributing factor in many circumstances because the impacts of climate and the outcomes that we are all going to experience are not making a decision about who they're going to impact, so it transcends political parties, it transcends governmental structures. We are all being impacted by this. So this is a place where the military actually can influence through positive action and outcome because they too are dealing with this threat and must respond to it.
Okay.
So I think we have an opportunity there
well,
to do our part.
we'll get back to that, I think. Just make a little jump to another kind of a battlefield, and that's I think the battlefield for the diplomats is the meeting room. That's a different game, I guess. And Michaela Spade, a German colleague from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This year, Germany will be in, and the next year, I think, in the UN Security Council. That is where decisions are often made to intervene in dire situations like we just heard. What are your plans for this year? Will there be this connection between hard security and climate change? Is that on your agenda?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this panel. And who was here yesterday already heard, is that it is the climate and security is one of the main topics which we have taken up for, and we run our campaign to be elected to the Security Council on that issue. So we are very much pushing to take up the baton from the Swedes and work hard that the climate and security is an issue which will be mainstreamed in the policy of the Security Council. That is for clear, but I also don't quite see this problem of, I yesterday already spoke against the silos we have, and what you hear saying is there something like hard security? I mean, what is the opposite to hard security would be soft security. Is there such a thing than soft security? I think we all have, in critical situation when something hits, we all have to work together, as you quite rightly said. When we have a natural disaster or we have a hurricane hitting or something or the other, we have agencies, governments, NGOs, international community to work fiercely together. And I myself worked, for example, at the UNMIK very early after the war in Kosovo ended. And of course, we were agencies on the ground working together, but eventually the diplomats have, as you quite rightly said, you have to have negotiators to bridge the conflicts and to recognize. And I think this is why the climate and security climate security has to be part of the Security Council, because we have to be preventing a situation before we have the house. As I always say, we have to be there before the house is on fire. So we have to have the tools to recognize what is happening, where, as a good military also does, where is a critical situation developing and where do we have to talk to people, try to mitigate, and so on and so forth. And then we come to the development side, which is, sorry to say, also one tool that we develop and that we mitigate, and this is, at the end of the day, it's all a package, and we should just be open to recognizing that climate and security is part and parcel of all our politics, our behavior, our brief.
Is the Security Council the right arena to address this?
Very much so. I'm saying yes, because as I said, if you look into the charter, what is the purpose of the Security Council? It is to safeguard peace, and so it's part and parcel of it, because as we have said before, it might increase fragile states, but I even go so far that states which seem to be stable at the moment might be affected and become critical states. In my opinion, we're too much looking at the moment in our analysis at places which are already fragile, most likely of climate change, but there are cases where we can already see now that if we don't act, we will have a crisis on our hand. And this is not, and I'm underlining this, only Africa, that's very much Asia, and this is also developed countries. Like us, we are affected by it as well.
No, that's why I'm asking. I just returned from a meeting of the G20 in Japan, where I met your colleagues as well. And if there's one arena where it's difficult to get any traction or to make any progress, it's the G20 on climate, because it's a difficult issue when you have 80% of the global polluters around one table. And the Security Council is, in its composition, having at least several of the same players. So that's why I ask, is it the right arena? Not because of its mandate, but because of political realities.
First of all, a diplomat can never say. I mean, if I have a brief, I mean, I wouldn't ever admit defeat, and I'm not the kind of person. I'm a little fighter on this one, because, as I said, I think we have a personal responsibility to work on this one, and I'm standing up to this. But at the end of the day, there are a number of countries in the Security Council, the non-permanent ones, which are very much on our side. On the P5s, it's. I mean, we have the big white elephant in the room, or maybe it's not a white elephant, but it's a real problem. We don't know how America, which used to be the one we could lean on this. We even don't have an ambassador at the moment. We know. I know how some of my colleagues think on the practical issue, but how they think and what Mr. Trump thinks might be different. But we will have to see. This is also the problem we have. 2020, talking about G20, we have Saudi Arabia as one of the countries and G7 the Americans. But back to the Security Council, we have Russia, who have for a general problem. Russia is opening up the mandate. They don't want women, peace, and all this so-called soft stuff in the Security Council. They think that belongs somewhere else. And then we have countries which I had to learn because I'm not a UN person. I'm coming outside there. We have the problem that there are some affected countries, as I said yesterday already, in the G77 who don't want that the Security Council deals with this because they think it belongs into the General Assembly. And I think we have also to look into this, that they allow us and support us, that we in the Security Council are not taking anything from the importance and the General Assembly or any development aid or anything else. I don't know whether you were present in Katowice when this diplomat from Bangladesh said to me, yes, they were for dealing with this problem, but it belonged into the General Assembly because Bangladesh is afraid that development aid will be withdrawn once it is securitized. And I think this is a thought which we have to ban out of the head of...
I'm glad you touch upon that because it's a kind of a different angle than we just heard from the military perspective, where it seemed to help that we brought climate change into that arena because it brought it higher up on the agenda. Here it's more difficult because it gets contentious at the same time. And
no, but I mean, I think it's in a sense the surprising thing to me, and maybe it's a wrong impression, is that people we want to help in a certain way want to keep it in their angle instead of giving it to the club of the big guys, as it is felt. But I think it is necessary, and we have to understand that the Security Council, it's a bit like 20 years ago, if you thought about gender or anything, nobody, I mean, it was a strange and alien thing for the junior officer or something, and today it is mainstream. So, I mean, maybe climate change is a bit the same.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll get back to that one as well, and perhaps touch upon a few other arenas as well. But move to your neighbor, Richard Clark from DFID. That's the other D in our title, the development in this case. Is this question different in your world as well? How did it how is it moving up in your ranks when it from being an isolated topic, one of the policy subjects, at least that's how it was for a long time in the environmental part of development. It's moving up, it's mainstreamed, it's top priority, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me say a couple of things. This is working all right, isn't it? Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
So let me say a couple of things. I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is I wanted to come back quickly on the point that my colleague just made. I mean, I think there is a real... it's absolutely right for us to focus on either the unintended consequences or, frankly, if we're not really careful, the way in which the countries with which we work and partner potentially see this as an agenda that's being imposed on them. I mean, I think that is an entirely appropriate and sensible risk for us to caution against. Now, in the world of development, I'm relatively new to it. I've spent the vast majority of my career working in security and intelligence policy, and I've been in the development world for 6 months. So from my perspective, actually, this kind of...
you bring the right tools.
I'm now fully on. But I think there is... But in the world of development, that risk is not a new one. I mean, that sense that we... if we do this wrong, that donors turn up and say, we have come to solve this problem for you, and a country says, thanks very much indeed, but actually that's not the problem we're most concerned about right now. I think there is a level of demand and urgency being articulated by countries globally that face the starkest risks around this that we are, frankly, honor bound, I think, to listen to. So while I very strongly agree, and my government very strongly endorses the idea that the Security Council is the right place to be having these kinds of conversations, it's not the only place to be having them by any means. I mean, you asked about the way in which climate change is perceived in development at the moment. I think I'd answer that in two. There are kind of two angles through which we're seeing at the moment. I've just been appointed as part of my job as the DFID Climate Change Reduction Champion. I think I was technically the Climate Change Champion, but I said I thought Climate Change Reduction Champion was probably a better title. And I think there are sort of two angles to this, really. The first is there is just a level of political urgency, I would say, in the last 3 or 4 months that feels genuinely different to the preceding kind of 15 years or so. It's partly a combination of the frequency with which new reports are coming out. It's partly around the sense in which, at least in the UK, not a political context at the moment that you would say is typically characterized by consensus. There is a very, very strong consensus around the threat of climate change at the moment. And so I think there is a genuine kind of urgency from politicians of all persuasions who work in anything, and particularly development. There's a kind of urgency around that. The second, and sorry, just very quickly, I think you asked earlier on about the relationship between the military and this topic. One thing I'm very struck by, and I thought your point about being described as the Green General was really interesting, because I think there are moments where people in uniform, or whether that's a military uniform or a police uniform, or people who are not climate professors saying these things, has a power that cuts through to the public, I think, in a way that. So I think politicians are listening to that. The second area is the evidence just shows that there is a really serious risk, if I put this very simplistically, that climate change will completely eradicate the work we've done so far, and will completely eradicate any hope we have of delivering the SDGs, the sustainable.
So if we turn it around, you can't do your job well if you don't address it.
Absolutely not. No, definitely not. And while you could say, well, that's true of anything, I mean, it sort of is, but not in the same kind of scale. We're projecting 100 million people by 2030 could be driven into poverty as a direct result of climate change. And that is, those kinds of numbers, we absolutely have to be thinking about in a serious way, responding to that.
You are now responsible for humanitarian aid, right?
Yeah.
You could call that, and I'm exaggerating a bit, as the end of the line.
Yep.
Yesterday we heard the term prevention being introduced. Is it your objective to become redundant in that respect and work with others on that prevention side, or is it you plan your budget and wait what happens? Or
yeah. So when I was a child, when I was growing up, we had two. We used to have big campaigns to raise money on children's television, and there were two kind of classic images we had. One of them was poverty. This country is poor, and we'd like more children to be able to go to school. And the other was we've had some terrible flood. If that kind of distinction between poverty reduction and humanitarian crises was ever really a legitimate one, it is completely blurred now. We have an entire generation of Syrian children who have lost access to probably the finest primary education system in the Middle East as a result of the war. The idea that solely a humanitarian response to that, in the sense of someone turning up and putting in place shelter, absolutely critical in the hierarchy of needs sense. The idea that there was that you could take a solely humanitarian response to that crisis, I think is, and we're increasingly seeing that, I think, in crises around the world. So what we're trying to do is firstly bring the humanitarian actors and development actors together as much as possible, and actually organisations like the military, I think, often represent a really useful kind of way to bring those communities together. The second thing we're doing is we're trying really hard to shape the humanitarian international policy context in the way that we're doing with development. That's a lot easier, I think, I and our partners are finding on the development side than it is on the humanitarian. There is still a sense, I think, that if you are somebody who is experiencing a humanitarian crisis as an individual, you might have a different international agency turning up each day to you to do a different thing. We do the roof and we do the walls and we do your access to cash. So I think there's still much more we can do. And then finally, I think your point about prevention, I think, is absolutely right. So we've been very public in the UK that we want to try to get ahead of the curve on humanitarian issues. So some of that's just very practical, where we forward position our facilities, how we partner with other countries, how we partner with NGOs. But some of it is also much more in this sort of space. So I was having a conversation this morning over a coffee before the plenary about how we can use data and the huge opportunities, things like big data, how we can use data to be able to predict where things are likely to happen, and putting that data in the hands of humanitarian actors. There's still a long way to go in it, but I
Yeah.
think climate change is a great way into that debate.
But so basically, the rise of the temperature, the climate change,
Yep.
extreme weather events, basically forces you to have other tools in your toolbox as well. You have to explore different
Yeah.
means to do your job well.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think to be clear, I don't know whether this particularly matters, but I think it is very important that we within this room are clear about circumstances in which we are arguing that climate change creates a new context, and those situations in which, bluntly, we are using climate change because it's a topical moment to push on things that we want to do anyway.
Yeah.
You don't, the temperature doesn't necessarily in the world need to be rising for there to be a big problem about how we deliver humanitarian support in a conflict. Climate, I think, is a really good way into that debate, and there are also aspects of it that will need to be different. You know, we will probably, water scarcity, for example, I think is something that we need to have a particularly acute focus on. We probably don't have quite the tools in the same way that we have in other areas.
All right, thank you for that. This was all talk from, let's say, a Western perspective about what we try to accomplish elsewhere. I spoke about the objective. The objective is build resilience, making others more resilient. It's an easy segue to you, Mr. Jackson. In a sense, we've been talking about you as well. You have been sensing what's going on, and you work with people and perhaps yourself as well, of being resilient, and you experience what difference it makes when you are resilient or when you're not. What do you think if you listen to people that work in those, what I just earlier called arenas, whether it's a meeting room or it's a battlefield or it's from the development perspective, how does that help you? How does that impact you?
That's an interesting question. Certainly as I sat here and listened to my other colleagues speak, you have a sense of the issue of diplomacy from the point of view of the support you extend to governments within the Caribbean, providing them the technical input to engage in the negotiations and discussions to address some of these issues. But it becomes more real when you hear people who are certainly in this space having the conversation around, you know, what they have to navigate in that regard. And certainly on the question of whether the UN Security Council is a space. I mean, from where we sit, we think every space of advocacy counts for us. We're on the front line, not the only countries, of course, in the world, but the Caribbean certainly is on the front line of this issue around the changing climate. And so it becomes even more real to us as we grapple with resource scarcities, access issues, and coping with the development issues both internally and externally. And so, you know, as I listen, I'm really concretizing in my mind a clear understanding of what we all bring to the table to try to achieve this ultimate goal of security and safety for people generally, but certainly for those of us in the Caribbean. In listening to the issues related to the role of military, you know, again, for us, we see the military as being a very critical instrument, partner, however you want to describe it, in our processes. And so they're very much connected into our platforms around development or humanitarian actions, however you may want to slice it. They're connected to the conversations around what we're trying to achieve for various reasons. One, they're highly well-trained. They bring levels of innovation. They have certain capacities sometimes which do not lie within the broader civilian realm or easy access to the civilian realm. And so we've worked very closely with our Caribbean military actors, but reached out to partner with those military actors that have an interest in our space to essentially address some of the challenges which we face.
Are you saying, because the typical images that reach Europe when a hurricane hits the Caribbean is we wait one day, if we're lucky, we wait 2 days, but then the military come in and help you? Are you saying now they come in at an earlier stage because there is a different way of looking at this, if you talk about resilience?
Absolutely. I think we're looking at trying to ensure that we can activate the support with some level of predictability. And to do that, we are blending you know, the use of data, technology, modeling, and engaging all of the actors there. Because, of course, if we want to garner this support, you know, we have to have the same common picture. And so we're working more towards that, both in terms of harnessing internally what we have as military, but also connecting those dots between our military and the external military actors of the UK, US, Canada, the Dutch, the French, etc. We've also gone ahead working with our UK colleagues and being joined by some of our other military colleagues to develop what we call the Multinational Civil Military Coordination Cell. And that is essentially to ensure that we can access the capacities and support in a much more timely manner. Again, because they're common interests in this particular space. Blending this hard and soft security context to look more at how we use intelligence, how we use data, to join up our collective efforts for a common good.
But when people in Jamaica talk about security, it's just the security of their house, I guess. It's
not really. Well, yes. I mean, the traditional day-to-day security is the issue. For us in the Caribbean, the whole definition of human security is perhaps more prominent rather than the traditional view of security when we look at the military context, because of course we're not at the forefront of a war, conflict.
no.
Our war is the war against the ravages that natural hazards can unleash. Mostly part of our own making, obviously, and this is where we talk about development. The field development internally or the external development pressures vis-a-vis climate change and the impact it can have on our space. And so it brings me back to this whole issue around the nexus between development, diplomacy, and trying to ensure that we can, encourage our global partners to reduce some of those externalities that impact on our capabilities to be more resilient. And I think I heard, it may have been General Millendorf or the other speaker who talked about trying to prevent the problem before it becomes a hard security issue. And I think that is the key thing that we're pushing for internally, but also in terms of our diplomacy in the spaces of advocacy, such as the Security Council, the GA, and others, to see how we can prevent and avert what may very well be a global crisis requiring a hard security actions.
If I'll get to you, Michaela, after you want to react to this one, but just one extra question on that one. What did you do differently than when you entered those arenas, when it became diplomatic, when you went to the Security Council? Did you have to do things differently then? Can you give me a practical example?
Well, fortunately for me, I'm not in the spaces of the Security Council. And so my role really is to provide our diplomatic corps with the information and the tool to make their case. And so I'm a little bit removed from that direct conversation. And so being here and listening also helps, which is the point I was making, that beyond simply providing the information, that you are understanding the context of the discourse and the considerations that have to go into that conversation in places like the UN Security Council. And essentially it's all about the fact that there will be winners, there will be losers, and how can you leverage those spaces to ensure that, in our case, certainly as we try to grapple with this issue of resilience, which isn't static, it is aspirational, because with each event, you are at a different stage. The people survive, and we say they are resilient, but the platforms on which they can ensure the future is something that is continuously challenged. So we use these spaces to leverage our position, and really look at partnerships that can help us in that discourse.
You wanted to react, Michaela?
No, I just wanted to make also a point where we think about resilience, and I think what we all have now in front of our eyes are destroyed, after a hurricane, a destroyed island or something. But I think where we really have, and my government reacted to this, is the financial impact this had. And I remember when I was at the General Assembly this year, we had a meeting of the G3, and Jamaica is a member there, and the leader of the Jamaican group said, what is a real problem for us is we used to have one hurricane and then 5 years nothing, and we are a middle-income country, and we have, for our disaster, we have to get the loans at normal conditions. And now if it hits every second year, the finances of these countries get really they can't actually refinance and so on and so forth. And this is a major follow-up, and I think Britain has reacted on that, and we have reacted on this, and on the basis of the G20 decision in 20 and of our presidency, we have started this global partnership for climate disaster insurance and risk financing with the V20, the most vulnerable countries, and in order to hedge against risks for these countries. So we have a possibility to find with insurances a reassurance system which will cover about 400 million people, and so that the rebuilding can be financed, and also countries who are the more developed. Some of the Caribbean countries are not the poorest of the poor, and so their financial system would expose them to extreme risks. And I think we have really to think about those follow-ups, where all of a sudden a relatively stable economy gets threatened by the refinancing and by the debts which it incurs by rebuilding the country. And as soon as they have rebuilt, the next storm hits. And I think this is something we don't have so much in our mind, but we should look at. And I'm very glad that my country responded to that. That was just another issue where I thought also that diplomacy and development aid can work together on this, and also the private sector.
And do you think the current financial architecture globally is fit for its task, or?
I think we have realized there is a problem, and we putting our money there and try to help out on this issue. I know that Britain will have the lead on this issue for the climate summit in the fall under Guterres, and I hope that this will give a push that people also realize that there's more than the hard rebuilding in the sense of rebuild after a storm, the houses and so on, but to stabilize the financial system, because we have seen what it means if our financial system is not in balance. That has consequences, because one bank went bankrupt in the States. We had a worldwide financial crisis, so we have to look there to be very careful as well.
So resilience definitely has a financial component to it.
Yes,
It makes sense to all of us. If you're hit by a disaster and you can't pay for rebuilding your roof, you're in trouble.
You have developed to the point where you are a middle-income country. You know, so you have made steps, and all of a sudden you have to pay higher interest than a very poor country. That's actually a problem, especially in the Caribbeans and so on and so forth. And one which we hadn't so much on the radar, which is a new one and which we have to follow up on.
Now you're all on the edges of your seat. This is where I wanted to have you. I have General Middledorp that wants to say something, but perhaps quickly on the UNSG summit before I turn to you, because then we stay on this topic.
Yeah. Do you want me to come back quickly on the?
You're taking the lead on the resilience track.
So absolutely. So I think there are three really interesting ways into this question about finance. The first is, as Michaela's just said, I think is absolutely right, that particularly for middle-income countries, there is a kind of World Bank to IMF transition, IMF Article 4 approach. You know, there's all sorts of issues around the way in which non-concessional financing works that I think needs to be at the centre of this debate. And I think Germany is absolutely right to push hard on that, and we're entirely supportive. The second question, I think, is you asked a question about the nature of global financial architecture, which is quite a big question.
There's another session.
Exactly. Yeah, that's after lunch. I think our sense is that the insurance sector and the big finance industries are really up for having this conversation. It is absolutely in their interest to make sure that this system works, and governments around the world, I think, have an opportunity to bring people together. We will definitely be looking to do that in the summit in September. It's one of the kind of big themes we want to look at, partly because it's the right thing to do, and partly because, of course, in the City of London, we've got a lot of the big insurance and reinsurance financial sector. So I think we need to be prepared to get into some of the kind of gritty reality of the detail of how that really works. That's certainly something we found has been worth, if you'll excuse the pun, has been worth the investment in education and health, where we're as likely now to have a conversation about how you structure a loan book in relation to education as we are about whether you know how you design a school, as it were. And then the third thing, just quickly, is I think there's also a set of questions for us and the private sector about the way in which we are doing development and the way in which the private sector is doing investment. So there is, you know, no one is at the moment, people are pricing in maximum risk. And if we can try and both, so you asked about mitigation and adaptation earlier on, if we can try and both mitigate down and we can also increase the adaptation, there is a real chance that the private sector will come in at a rate that is entirely reasonable. If we do neither of those things, there's a real risk that the private sector will say, okay, fine, well, I'll build my factory here, but I'm going to price it at such an unbelievably high risk that you're re-adding to the point Michaela made about the pressure on the economy itself. But in relation to the point about the summit, just quickly, so we see finance as being a really important part of that. We're very keen to make sure that that summit is something that is done collectively, that feels like an endeavour in which countries around the world, including those who are most vulnerable, are shaping that conversation. And we definitely see security as an important part of that. I think my challenge back to this group is to think hard about, in what will be a very busy, kind of very narrow bandwidth approach, what are the kind of 2 or 3 things that really make a conversation about climate through the lens of security different from the other kinds of conversations we might have? If I may say, I think the question about the risk of people feeling that their experience is securitized is a really good one. We need a couple of other things, I think, that feel like that and feel really practical.
That could be a very practical outcome of this conference and of this panel, that this is something to be picked up, because I think this, as you call this community, this initiative can help build that narrative and make that a concrete outcome in September in New York. So that's, I think that the colleagues in the room will be happy to work on that. So,
Thank you.
General Middendorp, you have been patient and wanted to react to something that was said earlier,
Well,
I think.
very briefly, just to emphasize the point made by Mr. Jackson, that we should be ahead of the game. And ahead of the game is not just about improving resilience of infrastructure, which Anne is an expert in, but it is also about improving the resilience of our civil military mechanisms. And it requires that we sit down together in advance and go through scenarios and develop contingency plans on what can happen and who can bring what to the table to help deal with it. And if you don't do it in advance, then you're always in a reactive mode and you're always too late. If I look in the Netherlands, 25% of my whole defense force was committed to national tasks, to national security, in support of civil authorities. And we have done this analysis. We have done several scenario analysis of floodings, of chemical plants exploding, etc. And we looked at, okay, what are the limits of what the civil responders can do? And then we looked, okay, what can the military add to that? So how can we be complementary to each other and bring these worlds together? And what kind of arrangements are needed to make that happen in time? And if you don't arrange that in advance, then you're always too late. So now we have a number of units, a whole list of units that are on different kinds of reaction times to make sure that we are in time when something like this happens. And I think in all countries on the national level, we should make these kinds of arrangements climate change proof and readdress these arrangements and make sure that we can deliver what we talk about. And I'm sure that in most countries this is not the case. So there is work to do. And in those countries, and there are many countries who cannot deal with extreme weather events on a national level, they need international help. So also on a regional level, like the Caribbean, we need wider multinational mechanisms to do that, which makes it harder, but also more important to to do it. Yeah, so that's the point I would like to stress in reaction to that.
I'll push you a little bit on that one. You say in many countries it's not the case, they're not prepared. Can you give an example of where it could go wrong? Where do you see those shortcomings?
I think we don't have proper assessments on, if I look at the European countries, in many countries, on how climate change can impact your country. We have several experts, all on their niche areas, looking at how it impacts on their area, but make that comprehensive and how it all affects each other, and deal with it in a comprehensive way. I've not seen that happen. And I've not been, at least in the Netherlands, I've not been involved in discussions on how climate change, the sea level rise will affect the Netherlands and what the military can do in those cases.
Okay, that could be another concrete one, although I think there will be experts in the room who might point you at a few instances where it
I hope
does
so.
work.
I hope so.
You were going to say that in Jamaica that's not the case, right?
Not only in Jamaica.
Okay.
I think a lot of work is being done in the science community to really downscale this particular information and to get a real sense of what the sort of long-term implications are for the islands. The short-term implications are fairly well understood, but looking at the sort of accelerant that climate change presents is something that we're looking at more and more. This is all being put together within the context of, both nationally but also regionally, the work that we're leading and doing, and trying to ensure that there's greater predictability and understanding around where gaps are. And we're doing that not alone. I mean, we're working with U.S. Southern Command year over year on certain exercises to look at HADR alongside some of the regular security threat issues. That is being ramped up this year to look now at how both internally but also externally, what are the gaps and how those gaps can certainly be addressed. So to support your point that it is a must-do, but also to say that in our context we're doing it. And I represent an organization which is very much developed by Caribbean people for Caribbean people, which is bringing the capacity of the region to try to address a particular problem. The challenge on our side is certainly on the resources, the sort of equipment and capacities that we see available in the military, certainly not immediately at hand within the civilian community. And so that's something that we're looking at to see how best we can use things like the military ship, Dutch, UK, and others that may be in the water addressing the overseas territories but are able to support non-OT and to make that a little bit more predictable. So you're not being reactive. You are there, you understand what our needs are going to be when these events happen. That's where we're now taking it and exercising this multinational civil military coordination center.
Yeah. That's something you recognize, I guess.
Yes, I have a couple of things to respond to. First, I want to
Okay,
respond to
please, go
Michaela
ahead.
talking about
Yeah.
the elephant in the room without actually talking about the elephant in the room. Just 3 points I would make.
I didn't want to bring the elephant up, but if you talk about the elephant, we're going to talk about the elephant.
The elephant is here, and this will be my opinion. But I think, first of all, and you're certainly correct that we do not have an ambassador to the UN at the moment, and the most recent candidate withdrew her name over the weekend, so who knows how that will go. But we are moving on within the United States on this issue because we are being impacted by it, and we can't deny it. And so there is certainly progress in spite of very strong headwinds in some circumstances. Most significantly, the intelligence community's most recent report, National Intelligence Strategy 2019, calls out climate and security as an issue, climate as a threat and a challenge, and under many of the circumstances in which we have described. So there's this continuing, and also within the Department of Defense, within USAID, looking at global fragility and climate impacts. Reports continue, they're asked for, they are done, there is progress. Behind the scenes, certainly, DoD is still working to make progress, and they will continue to do that. For the same reason, they have this responsibility to prepare, they have to be able to execute their mission, they must work within their local communities. So we must move forward, and we are moving forward in spite of political challenges. They're certainly there. And we realize we're not the only nation. Yesterday afternoon, General, in our conversations, there were others in the room who will remain nameless who also described similar circumstances, at least on occasion. So we will continue to move forward. We understand this responsibility, I think, as really as a nation, but certainly from a military perspective, that we can move forward to understand the risk and that we know what's happening. And a lot of discussion yesterday about data and the need for data and analyzing data and using it. That's certainly a context that will help us gain more foresight so that we can move forward, absolutely. Now, in the context of preparing for the humanitarian assistance, which we've just been mostly recently talking about, and defense support to civil authorities, certainly within the military in the United States, we've had opportunities to do this, Katrina, most substantially, and it is a mission area, but the challenge is that it's always competing with something else. And so for us, keeping that on the forefront, knowing that we have this need because we are experiencing these issues ourselves, or they are happening in our backyard, they're happening in the Caribbean and other places in the South Pacific. The commander of Indo-PACOM, Admiral Phil Davidson, just very recently this month testified about having to work in Saipan and Tinian to help those areas recover. So yes, those are more closely related to the United States, but we certainly have this need there. The challenge is keeping the capacity, keeping the training and the opportunities there, and driving that as an issue that we must keep in the forefront, because we are going to have to do it, either within our own country or in support of humanitarian assistance more broadly. And that will always be a challenge, because you have just competing priorities in the military.
Now you brought the elephant in the room, and you spoke about the strong headwinds. The line of reasoning that you have is so logic, also from a strategic perspective. And I heard the American colleague in the G20 last week just say, we have a long history in the United States of responding to disasters. I thought, well, yeah, that is the case for prevention, right? And the best form of adaptation is mitigation. That's something that you can often hear. That means that you had to enter into a national political debate as well, I guess, in your active times. Or is that something that you could kind of circumvent?
Certainly from a military perspective, on active duty, we stay out of the political debate. We must stay out of the political debate. But in the context of looking at the ability to respond, to execute a mission, to train to a mission, we still have to remain viable. And a part of that context is building resilience, not only within our facilities, but within the greater community that we're dealing with. And where I live in Hampton Roads is a great example of that.
Yeah.
Huge federal presence, 1.7 million people. The federal presence cannot exist, operate, or execute its mission without the support of the greater community. It's that simple.
Yeah.
We're all in this together. And we get to the financing conversation, a huge issue, because in a country, a large country, there are many others, we're all being impacted at once. It's not an area where we can say, well, we'll deal with this small portion of the East Coast, and then we'll deal with Alaska, and then we'll deal with somewhere else. No, it's all happening at the same time. So the financial implications for that are substantial. Yes, the Department of Defense is funded, but this again, you get to the, well, what are the priorities? What are the priorities? And just this year, Marine Corps base on the East Coast, $3.6 billion worth of damage from Hurricane Florence. What next? What next for that facility? Air Force Base on the Gulf Coast also experienced extreme damage. And that's just this year. Last year there were others. Yeah. And so we're seeing the same kind of situation. It's building and building and building. And there is a need for a national dialogue. We're seeing within the government structure, certainly within the National Defense Authorization Act over the last 2 years, direction and expanded authorities for the Department of Defense to prepare itself and to work with the surrounding communities to help prepare them so that they can be ready for what's coming in advance of the need. But once you have something new and legislation, as certainly, General, as you well know, it's all very interesting, and everyone looks at it and admires it, and who is going to be the first person to put their toe in the water and actually start to move forward with that? So that's exactly where we are, and I'm living this right now within the state of Virginia, because I'm trying to push, let's take these new authorities, let's do something with them. Okay. And getting that momentum shifted to move forward in this context has been interesting, and it will continue to be so, I think.
Interesting, that's a diplomatic term, I
yes,
would say.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I'm working on my diplomacy.
You see, those worlds are influencing each other. Mr. Jackson, yeah.
Yeah,
maybe in your intervention, can you also perhaps include some of the conclusions that you reached at the local PSI conference that you just had in December?
Sure. I want to come back on the issue of financing, and then I can go to the conclusions. I want to make a plug for us to, insurance is important, and I find that quite a bit of the discourse is going into risk financing, but heavily on the insurance side, which is very important. But I think certainly in our part of the world, we are, even if we achieve 1.5 or lower, we're still going to be impacted by the ravages of climate. It doesn't heal overnight. So the humanitarian response is still going to be a reality we will have to face. And one of the biggest challenges which we're facing is financing for preparedness, or preparedness for response. Invariably, it's not I mean, other than DFID, who certainly we've seen DFID putting a lot of effort now into ensuring that there's some predictable financing for preparedness and response. It's not an area that has been effectively advanced. So we have to look at this issue of financing from the question of also affordability within the context of insurance, because invariably the level we need to get to, several of the countries in the region, most of them can't afford the cost of those premiums to ensure that there is effective. Yeah. So it's something that we have to look at. I just wanted to make that plug so that we avert the scarcities and access post-impact that can also lead to tensions and escalate the need for a security response, right? So that's something we have to look at. In terms of the initiative in the Caribbean, certainly we brought actors from across the region, both those that are CARICOM and non-CARICOM, including working with our partners, the Dutch, to bring the Dutch territories to that space as we are working to become a lot closer in terms of our working relationship. We had representation from the Dominican Republic. So broadening the sort of Caribbean engagement on this issue, to look at what we saw as critical priorities to have, not as a standalone, but also as a key message, a red thread, going through the spaces of dialogue. And we identified 6 things: strengthening capacity and knowledge for Caribbean SIDS on climate and security. And there are a set of actions and institutions will be called on to lead that, identifying a set of key experts that can influence the practice by providing the knowledge. Strengthening regional coordination in support of humanitarian crisis. And there we talked about enhancing and strengthening the regional response mechanism which SEDEMA leads to ensure that it can deliver on some of the things we talked about with the general. Advancing food security within the Caribbean context. At the moment, we import quite a bit of our food, and that is subject to also the challenges that are being faced in the source markets, and looking to see how we can address some of those food security issues within the Caribbean space where we have the capacity to do so. Looking at water security, and I heard one of our panelists did speak about the need to look at water quite significantly, and certainly that's something we agree with. It's in several agenda, but it is that important that it needs to be treated as a special issue. It is central even across hurricanes, floods, disasters. Right? How can we look at water in that context? Looking at renewable energy transitions within the Caribbean. What are the savings that can be unearthed? What I call the opportunities of mitigation in the Caribbean. Savings from renewable energy mix and how that can be used within the broader resilience building agenda was something we touched on. And then finally, the political side of it, advocating for political support for regional climate and security. How can we galvanize perspectives internally and externally to both deal with the diplomacy side, but also the actions we need to take internally to ensure that we can be more resilient. So these were 6 things we agreed on. We've proposed this. It's not signed off at the heads of government level. We've proposed this as a plan of action, identifying some of the key strategic partners to advance this, but more so recognizing that this is an integrated agenda within the context of so many other global agenda that exists, but using the planetary security space and the UN Security Council process, again, as another pathway for advocacy around how some of these issues can be treated, given that they are present in a number of other global aspirational agenda and national, sort of 2020 vision documents.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Just a brief on the Security Council. It was, I think, very important that the Dominican Republic, who has been elected for 2 years to the UN Security Council, flagged climate and security as one of their issues. And then we had this discussion in January, which was initiated once by a country which was affected a lot. And although it was about main weather events, more or less, it gave my minister at least the opportunity to deliver, I think, a very well-received speech. And
it's the kind of cooperation you could also seek.
We actually, the Dominican Republic came to us a few months before they had and coordinated with us how we should set up this whole thing, and we very gladly helped them in this because we saw it as a real opportunity that for once, it's not, as I always say, the white men in black suits who are taking up this issue instead of the countries who are affected.
Yeah.
Because this is the one problem, that so far it has been an issue, climate and security, which has been very much forced by the Western countries, which is very good, and the rich Western countries. And in our group of friends, we have especially founded our group of friends for climate and security in the UN with Nauru, which is a very affected country, one of the smallest states in the world, not more than a street in Beijing, 20,000 people. But however, it is important that we have them on board, and that we have by now 40 countries which are working there, and we're working hand in hand. But I think it's a very important thing that it's flagged up this way. And we have to get people to support us, and we're pushing very hard also on Indonesia that they will join us, and because they're also an affected country in Asia, but we have to see, as I said before, to get the right countries and the right support.
It's always a good sign when the room fills up during your session. That means we're doing something right here. So maybe it's just because you slept in after yesterday's drink in the bar. But thanks for coming all. I think I have to reward that by get you involved as well. So if there are any questions in the room that you would like to ask to the panelists, please. I see several hands already. I saw someone in the back over there. Let's start there. Please, if you could state your name and your affiliation, and please be brief. We do not have that much time left.
Sure, thank you very much. Jan Selby from University of Sussex.
One of the scientists in the room. We saw you were here. Yeah.
Thanks. So, the resilience of poorer societies and communities is, of course, not just an internal matter, but is bound up with all kinds of external forces and relations, most importantly, the way in which they're integrated into the global economy. And that often poses some quite difficult questions. I'll give you an example, which is a particular concern of mine, which is groundwater. So groundwater is clearly absolutely crucial to resilience against extreme weather events. When the rains are poor, people can turn to groundwater to continue or increase their exploitation of groundwater for crop production. But at the same time, much of that groundwater and the food which goes into producing is being exported to the global north in the form of our food supplies. And in that sense, the resilience and groundwater levels are declining across much of Africa and Asia and elsewhere. So in that sense, northern, western consumption practices are actively undermining aspects of the resilience of those societies.
Yeah.
How is that sort of issue being considered by some of the government representatives within their thinking about resilience strategies?
I'll take 2, 3 more, and then I think you know who to answer. Can answer this. Just on too many hands. I can't have you all, but just continue to the left side of the aisle. The gentleman, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Willem Verwerda from Common Land and IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management. Thank you very much for the discussion. However, what I miss is, as part of the resilience issue, a holistic landscape restoration, long-term commitment and based on local partnership. So far, we don't see in many governments a long-term ecosystem approach, while we know that this is the basis of building resilience at the landscape level. Military can really help, I think. Quite often they lack the expertise, but they can bring in agriculture, forestry, water expertise, biodiversity expertise. So my question is, how would this be, can this be part of your, let's say, conclusions of this conference?
Okay.
This is about doing, and we know all the technology, we know that finance is needed, but it's just, it's possible. Thank you.
Point well made, thanks. Just the lady in front of you. Yeah.
Hi there, thank you for a lively discussion. I'm Stephanie Wesch from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And my question is, given the transformative challenges that we're facing, it's great that the topic of climate and security is getting more attention now, but where we can make the biggest difference is at home. And now, Ms. Speth, I'm sure can attest to that. You know, in Germany, we've set ourselves a 20-year horizon to get out of coal. Now, we need more transformative action. So how can we, isn't it a bit hypocritical to look at the security challenges elsewhere in our own countries also, without actually tackling the issue where we can have the most impact, which is at home in terms of mitigation? So how do we reconcile those two realities?
Yep, thank you. One more on this side, lady. There, a mic is on its way.
Thank you. Katie Peters from the Overseas Development Institute. I've been really intrigued by the way that climate-related disasters have been used in the discourse on climate security. Climate-related disasters have been cited both as a threat source and also as a manifestation of security impacts of climate change. And Richard, you talked about getting ahead of the humanitarian curve. Ronald, you talked about prevention before climate and disaster risk become a hard security issue. And yet I've not heard the word Sendai framework mentioned at all. Would a doable policy priority not be to support countries, particularly fragile and conflict-affected countries, to actually deliver on their commitments under the Sendai framework?
Thank you. I'm afraid we haven't mentioned many words, but this is a relevant one indeed. Thanks for. I'll just start with you. If there are any questions you would like to respond to.
I can respond to the number 2, the question about the resilience, the long-term ecosystem approach, which hasn't particularly been addressed, to agree with the questioner. Yes, there is a need, and developing that is certainly a challenge within. I would speak within my own country,
yeah.
Within many countries. There's absolutely a need for a national approach. There's actually absolutely a need for a long-term analysis and understanding of how this will be done at that level, and so far there's a lot of. I would say this: there's a lot of individual work being done at states, within the states, in the United States. So many states are doing this for themselves, and within that you see regional efforts and you see local efforts. So these things can eventually, and I know will eventually, be rolled up to create a broader and much broader approach nationwide. But I guess my question back would be. It sort of depends on the circumstance what is the most place-based adaptive strategy for a long-term ecosystem solution. How is that the best way for that to be done?
That's a discussion you can have.
That's a discussion, yes.
You say that we can take it up.
Some national efforts yesterday, actually, in the military discussion. We heard of some much broader national resilience-based, broad. Not just national security-based efforts on the part of some countries that were very interesting.
So we thank you for the suggestion.
Thank you.
I think this is a concrete one to be taken up. Mr. Middendorp?
Yeah, I could react on both the ecosystem approach and how to facilitate that, but also how to translate that to the practice on the ground and using new technologies for water, for energy, etc. If you look at this table, this is kind of a whole of government table.
Yeah.
So we have the Ds of development, defense, and diplomacy. And during the last 10 years, we have learned to work together. I think the next step that we should take is the step from cooperating to integrating, which is much harder. Not only on the government level, but also on the ground level, where we have to do our work. And that's a harder step to take. And the second step I would like to mention is that this is not enough. We need to interact with the civil companies, we need to interact with innovators, with think tanks, with others. So we have to build a wider ecosystem. And building that wider ecosystem should be done on a global level, but that's very wide, but also on a regional level. And I can give you a practical example.
You knew I was going to ask that, huh?
Sorry?
You knew I was going to ask that, the practical example. So please go ahead.
I was hoping for it.
Yeah.
Are you going to ask it?
Yeah. Can you give me a practical example?
Well, good that you ask it. A few years ago, we had a Future Force conference where we brought together 1,300 participants from all over the world on the topic of security. And these were non-military participants, but all kinds of stakeholders. And there we discussed a range of security-related topics, like megacities, climate security, etc. And what that platform did is connect all these networks. And they had very different agendas, but they had a common interest on these topics. And on this common interest, they could find each other and connect with each other. And I think that formula can be used on a regional level to enforce what the question was, to make sure that we institutionalize that and really make it, translate it into the practice of that region, because every region is very different and the problems are very different. In this conference, I offered defense as kind of a platform for innovation. And I think defense can do a lot in there. And it's a win-win situation because it also helps defense. And the trigger for me was Mali. We had a mission in Mali, and in Mali, I noticed that wherever the UN is building a base, they drill holes in the ground for groundwater, but they draw away the water for the local villages. So they are only increasing the local problems, which is not very helpful. And they take in a lot of fuel, they consume a lot of fuel. They're the biggest fuel consumer in the country, I believe. So the prices of fuel go up and the people suffer from it. So there are a lot of negative effects of a mission like that and how to mitigate those effects. And I think green technologies can help mitigate those effects. It can also help the local population. So in this conference, I was approached by a man called Ab Verheggen. And he's in this room. I will introduce him later. And he said, I have got a wild idea. And my idea is to extract water from the air. And at first I thought he was crazy. And I almost walked away, but then I said, okay, let's try this. And I offered the base in Mali as a platform for him to test his innovation. So he went along with us, we put him in a plane with all his team and his equipment, and he tested his invention. And eventually he succeeded in extracting water from the air in very limited numbers. But it get a lot of follow-on attention, and it resulted in a project with defense. And I'm very pleased to announce that within a few months, he's able to deliver a product that's this size, with a solar panel on top of it, fully self-sustaining, able to deliver 20 liters of water per day in a desert environment.
That's very nice. Yeah.
Just imagine the impact of such a problem on water scarcity.
Yeah. And it also, this is defense as the platform for innovation, as you say, but it's also touching on the strategic issues that you often face. You become much more self-reliant, but it's also in terms of the image that you have as a military. You're not coming and demolish a place after you leave. They see your footprint. You basically leave the place better as it is, which is of enormous value, I would say. So
I would say so too, and it's also a tool for development. So you can also use the same technology to help the local populations improve their situation. So it is a really win-win. And the same is on fuel. I think there is an enormous opportunity for the military to make this transition to new energies. Because the biggest burden for any military is the logistics. Yeah. And we have to bring in enormous piles of stocks into any mission area. Very expensive. We have to protect that. It's our Achilles heel. So many forces are dedicated to logistics. And the more we can reduce that and make units self-sustaining, the cheaper it becomes, the more ecological footprint we have in those surroundings, and the more effective we can be in playing our part of the work. So energy transition should be a case picked up by the military. I don't see many military doing that. I know the US is working on it, but I think also here in Europe and other countries, we should pick that up. I had a good talk with Mr. Amin this morning, the Director General of IRENA, and he did excellent work on renewables and also on the geopolitical impact of renewables. And I was in his committee. It was a global committee where we assessed the geopolitical impact. And that might be enormous. If we are moving at the pace we are now moving, and that pace is only accelerating every year, then within 20, 30 years, we have a complete transition, which means that the current status of OPEC countries and oil and gas producing countries will completely change, which affects the geopolitical dynamics with all the consequences attached to it. So there is also a big geopolitical element to this technology that we are developing, which is also of importance to the military, and which they also should take seriously.
We now really got you going, and unfortunately we're approaching the end of the of this session, so I have to cut you short here. But
I have one more announcement, maybe at the end.
We'll do it at the end because we still have a few questions unanswered, and at least 3 speakers that I would like to give an opportunity to do so, especially because there were a few German questions coming from the public as well. So, Michaela?
Yeah, thank you. First, the why you should do at home what you preach abroad. Of course, this is true, but let's put it this way: Germany is one of the very high developed countries, which at the same time go out of the supposedly climate neutral nuclear, which I think is if you look at the extended costs in the long run, not true. So we go out of nuclear and coal within a relatively brief, short time, 20 years. And I think this is something to be copied by other countries. So I think we're not so bad on this one. And on the other hand, I'm very much in what you said, and also that the wonderful thing also which comes as a spirit out of the Paris Agreement is that we much more look nowadays into the local level and into the regional level. For example, California and the German state of Baden-Württemberg started the Under 2 coalition, which were two units, and by now it's more than 200 towns and regions which are in the Under 2 coalition, and see what they are doing. And also somewhere here most likely is a representative of the Association of the Towns and Major Cities who are working on this, and we will have a major summit in Heidelberg on this one also of the Under 2 coalition. And I think we also, and many people here must have been in San Francisco at the Global Action Summit, where you had this spirit, yes, we can do it, very much because there were so many innovators and young kids which had some ideas which they do on the digital side, where me as a daughter of an engineer anyways, has the idea that there are so many ideas which can be developed and done that we are not yet at the end, and I'm not hopeless that we will maybe find something we haven't even yet thought about, and we will do it because there is this spirit. And for example, at the BETD, the big conference which we will have in April, the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue, we also have a prize for the best innovative ideas. And last year, I'm too old to say they were, for me, they could have been my children or grandchildren. They developed this fridge where they also take energy out of the air, which doesn't have energy in itself, where you can store in desert areas, medicine to be given in refugee camps and so on and so forth. And this is important. And we, together with IRENA, finance a project where refugee camps will get energy out of renewables, which is very important to do this, because that is also a consequence often of climate and security. I think there is a major issue on this one. So that's all I have to say to this.
Thank you. Richard, and move on to you. Perhaps you can take up the Sendai
one
question
more point.
as well. Oh, yeah?
Sorry, and the white elephant for me is, of course, I know the states are doing a lot, but how they will react in the Security Council is still very much a political decision.
Look, good. I'm conscious of time. Let me just respond really quickly to kind of three of the points in one, which is I'm very, very strongly of the view that we need to be thinking about this in the context of what works locally in local ecosystems and various frameworks we can use to start thinking about that. I mean, just really briefly, when we did the Illegal Wildlife Trade Conference in London, which was a very specific, in some ways a very specific and you might argue in some ways quite narrow kind of way of thinking about things, but actually one of the great advantages of it was that it really situated those kinds of debates in the context of what local communities at a variety of different levels were thinking about how they were delivering. I think there are also some quite potentially uncomfortable issues for us as development donors and actors in this, not least your very good challenge about the way in which consumption practices in the north have an impact on that. But I completely agree.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll try and offer some feedback on at least three of the questions. On the resilience agenda, certainly at home in the Caribbean, we're focused on that. We've developed a resilience pathway as a corollary to our regional strategy around comprehensive disaster risk, which is 90% aligned to Sendai. It was developed before Sendai, but it's 90% in alignment. It looks at social protection for the marginal and most vulnerable. It looks at safeguarding infrastructure, enhancing economic opportunities, environmental protection, and operational readiness for recovery. So those are the pillars on which we are trying to advance a resilience agenda and conversation locally. However, in my delivery, I talked about the internal political, sort of advocacy that needs to take place, which is necessary to assure a sustainable political commitment to the internal actions that are required. Because we can say it, we can have the plans, but if we don't remain committed to it, then we're not delivering. And then, of course, also looking at the external partnerships and the reduction of externalities, which pose an existential threat to the resilience of small and fragile states. Right? So those are some of the things that, for us in the Caribbean, we can look at resilience how we want, if we're also not dealing with some of the externalities which we don't control. From an advocacy point of view, we're still going to be quite challenged. On the Sendai approach, it was inherent in my delivery, not magnified, but we are, in fact, from the Caribbean context, contributing to the realization of the imperatives of all of the big global agenda. What we're trying to do is to contextualize that within the manageability, because there's so many global agenda that needs to be really boiled down within the context of national strategies, so it's manageable, and that the internal architecture can deliver on it. So we very much believe in the aspirations of Sendai and are working towards that. And I will answer the question around, while it's not for us, but it's really looking at our bigger Western countries, I will offer a perspective on that security achieved at the expenses of others does not result in real security and peace. And I think at the dinner last night we heard that what we're all aspiring for is for peace and security. So I think as we look at this whole issue of climate change, one of the things we have to work together on is what are the things we can do at home, and why the Caribbean, even though we're not major emitters, ought to look at mitigation from the point of view of the benefits that we can derive on it, but also supporting the thought that the bigger countries ought to look also at their reduction of emissions. But it's a pathway to ensure that there is less need for a securitized approach where people can stay at home and can have a prosperous and safe and secure opportunities.
This is a very nice conclusion, I have to say. You make it full circle in this panel, but perhaps also for the whole conference. Unfortunately, this is the end of this panel. We just didn't get more time, although I think there's much more to be said, and it also was shown by the many hands that went up. You want to go deeper, and that's perhaps one conclusion that we can to draw from this panel. We have to go deeper. We have to find those touch points that can help us further. I started off by saying there are many definitions of resilience. It depends on where you sit and what perspective you have. I hope we managed to unpack it a little bit and to define it a bit sharper, what it means for us. I think from all three perspectives, or all five perspectives, we came to the conclusion that yes, resilience is the objective that we have. We bring all different tools to the table, and looking at the year ahead, we basically have to address several issues that are on the table, and it might help us further. And when we look at the military arena, that is building concrete partnerships, coming up with concrete examples, also get into the political arena every now and then. That political or diplomatic arena, we will have a busy year. You mentioned several conferences, also what Germany will do there, but I think we can add that other countries will be active there as well, and the Netherlands is happy to join you at several occasions. Also at the UNSG summit that you have talked about as well, where resilience is one of the 9 tracks that has been identified by the Secretary General. And we also, I think, cut the cake in different layers, the global, the national and the local, and there I think it's even most apparent that cooperation and partnership is absolutely necessary, not only when disaster has struck, but especially beforehand. So just, and this is by no means a full summary of what has been discussed, I would say to be continued, but not before we have done 2 things. One is give these speakers an enormous round of applause, because This was both instructive and entertaining, I think. And I promised to give you the final word. So please go ahead, Tom Middendorp, and then rightly after that we go to the coffee break.
Thank you very much. What I've learned in my career, that many of the solutions we are trying to develop are already out there. It's just a matter of finding them. I gave you an example of this guy who invented this machine to draw water out of the air. He's here. Up, could you step forward, please? Because I would like to introduce him to you. And it's not just about him, because he, for me, symbolizes the fact that everybody in this room can make a difference. And the impact that one person can have. Yeah. And he has been working on this invention, this idea of him, for a long time. And he practiced the motto that we used a while ago, think big, act small, start somewhere. He thought big. He thought about solving the water problem, and he acted small. He started with a small invention in Mali. And now he has built this device. But he's also developing a second device. And this second device is using kind of similar technology, but then to create a closed-circuit environment to grow crops in the desert. Based on a few solar panels, a closed system where he recirculates the water to grow crops. Because crops, 90% of the water they use, they evaporate again. And he recycles that. And the technology he developed can also cool the air in the container. So I think this is also a potentially groundbreaking event. He's in the room next to here, if you want to talk to him. For me, he symbolizes what every one of us can mean. And he also symbolizes the importance of us at the governmental levels to reach out to companies, to reach out to young innovators and give them a chance. Give them a chance to develop their idea and to help solve the problem we are all facing. Thank you.
Thank you. You'll have a busy coffee break, so thank you. Enjoy it.